Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back to this afternoon breakout session, which is asking the question, how can we achieve the goal of a free and open internet? And this session has very kindly been sponsored by Tech UK member Twitter. In this session, we're going to be really looking at kind of two broad questions. One is, how do we make sure that we can remain true to, in a way, the vision of the internet, which was very much about democratizing access to information and creating abundant opportunities for people to connect at a global scale. And then the second question we're really going to focus in on is one about openness in terms of research, and in particular how companies can work with independent researchers and external researchers so that we can get a better understanding of some of the ethical and policy questions that we face as services continue to develop. And we've got a fantastic panel to run the session with you today. I'm very pleased we've got Katie Minshall, who is head of public policy at Twitter. We've got Ruth Smeeth, who's CEO of the Index on Censorship. We've got Dr. Wasim Ahmed, who is senior lecturer from Stirling University. And we've got Carl Garnberg from the Internet Society. And we're going to start off with some opening remarks from Katie, and then we're going to open up into a bit of a Q&A. So Katie, over to you.
Thanks, Anthony, and thank you for inviting us to participate in today's summit. It's great to have the opportunity to work with Tech UK on this discussion. I'm just going to share some opening thoughts on this and then really look forward to hearing from the panelists. At Twitter, our belief is that the internet should be global, free, and secure. But today, the open internet has never been more fragile, and access to a secure and free web globally is being challenged by internet shutdowns, by market incumbency, by attempts from governments to silence or censor critics. And it's for these reasons we were so pleased to partner on this discussion and ask that question: how can we achieve the goal of a free and open internet? Taking a step back, Twitter enables every person the right to speak publicly within our rules. And this has helped lead to a major societal shift. Many people who lacked equal access to public platforms, say 10 or 15 years ago, especially young people and especially members of marginalized groups, are speaking on Twitter and on social media. And at its best, we've seen this support conversations like Me Too or Black Lives Matter or the climate activism of Greta Thunberg. However, over that very same period, we've seen other trends as well. In 2020, Access Now and the Keep It On Coalition documented at least 155 internet shutdowns in 29 countries, stopping journalists from being able to share current events, cutting off small businesses from their customers, and critically, preventing people from being able to access the most up-to-date information about COVID-19. Meanwhile, here in the UK and in other parts of the world, our competition watchdog has raised concerns about real risks of harm to consumers posed by a lack of competition in online services. A less competitive internet trends towards a less open internet. And the need for transparency across all sectors has really never been greater. That includes clarity from both technology companies and from governments about what content should and should not be permissible or protected online, especially as we move towards regulation. So I'd like to offer up 5 guiding principles that we believe will underpin successful policy in striving for an open internet. First of all, the open internet is global. It should be available to all and should be built on open standards and the protection of human rights. Second, trust is essential and can be built with transparency, procedural fairness, and privacy protections. Third, recommendation and ranking algorithms should be subject to human choice and control. Fourth, competition, choice, and innovation are foundations of the open internet and should be protected and expanded, ensuring incumbents are not entrenched by laws or regulations. And finally, fifth, content moderation is more than just leave up or take down. Regulation should allow for a range of interventions while setting clear definitions for categories of content. Now at Twitter, we consider our role in realizing these principles every day. One priority has been around how we can give our users far more understanding and control when it comes to algorithms. Now, at a basic level, back in 2018, we gave all our users the ability to turn the algorithm off on the home timeline, such that if you just want to see tweets from accounts you follow in reverse chronological order, then you can do so. Last year, we took this a step further by establishing Meta, our machine learning, ethics, transparency, and accountability team. Meta is a combination of researchers and practitioners embedded in Twitter to look specifically at our algorithms. Is there a risk of an algorithm causing harm? Is there a risk of bias? What mitigations do we need to put in place? And most importantly, this team are constantly working on how can we make sure we share that research publicly and transparently. And indeed, it's transparency more broadly that is foundational to the kind of internet we all want to see, and is essential to addressing the deficit in trust in many online services and government functions alike. One concern we have long held at Twitter is that we had been the only major service to make public conversation data available via APIs for the purposes of study. And while challenges do exist for online platforms when it comes to making data available, for us, it has brought considerable benefits. When COVID-19 happened, one of the first things we did was make available a dedicated endpoint about the public COVID-19 conversations taking place, so that research teams could use public Twitter data to map and examine aggregate increases in reported symptoms or in anxiety levels. Data also increases awareness and understanding of the scale and nature of the online challenges that we face. Since 2018, as an example, we've shared just over 40 data sets at state-backed information operations we've seen originating from 20 countries, spanning over 200 million tweets and 9 terabytes of data. Now, sharing this data and subsequently being able to work with a wide range of experts on these issues means that we can bring to bear on these challenges geopolitical, technical, social expertise beyond just that which is within Twitter. And so one of the critical areas where policymakers and regulators can enhance transparency, I think, is ensuring that laws governing information do provide that flexibility for valuable disclosures, like the provision of data to academics and researchers. Our view is that there is a really rich spectrum of work that could be enabled through smart regulation here and would support all our work in striving for an open internet. In fact, as we look to the future, our priority isn't just how we can make the open internet a reality on Twitter, but across the entire ecosystem. And it's with that in mind, we're so pleased to work with Tech UK on today's session and think about some of these challenges and key questions. Questions like, how can we develop regulation that doesn't just address the online harms we're trying to combat in 2021 or 2022, but also provides a positive vision of an open online world we want to enable in 2030 or 2040? How can we ensure governments are thinking both locally and globally about the internet and what steps we want to see them take? And fundamentally, as our online world continues to change and evolve every single day, how can we make sure that we, as users of the internet, have trust in it? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Katie. Gosh, there is an enormous amount to think about and respond to there. Carl, let me start with you and get your thoughts.
Thank you very much. And first of all, big thank you to the session organizers for organizing a session on this thematic, which I think is a really pressing and an urgent one. To Katie's point, it is something that we see large threats against the open internet. Now, I think what's interesting with this session, when you just look at the title in terms of having a goal of an open internet, is that when you look across the world, there seems to be some form of shared vision for having an open internet. When you look at statements from governments, whether it's the UK or whether in Latin America or international organizations, you often see, at least on paper, an explicit vision for an open internet. So the goal is out there, but it seems like you don't always practice the work towards that goal, but the goal is out there. And then the work might differ in terms of how we get to that goal of an open internet. And I think to Katie's point around internet shutdowns, that's sort of an extreme indicator of a diversion from that goal. It's hard to make the internet more closed than to shut it down. And it is a worrying trend that we see as well in terms of the extent to which this is used as a policy measures these days. And we actually have a tool that we measure internet shutdowns on at the Internet Society that we call the Pulse platform, where we look at internet shutdowns not only at the national level, but also down at the regional level. And we've captured a number of those just in the past 12 months and seeing that it's increasing. But I think in terms of threats to the open internet, we have those sort of deliberate efforts to close the internet, and internet shutdowns is a good indicator of that. But in many cases, it's not necessarily a sort of a conscious effort that works against the open internet. Sometimes it's a unintended consequence of pursuing other policy objectives. And a core issue there, I think, is that we're sort of lacking a shared understanding of what do we mean by the internet and what do we mean by an open internet. So what we did at our organization was to draw some inspiration from another policy field that have had a similar challenge in terms of safeguarding sort of abstract concepts out there, and that's the environmental policy field. And one of the most sort of innovative tools that we've seen in that space over the past 50 years is the practice of environmental impact assessments. And the sort of core logic in environmental impact assessment is that you take that sort of high level vision of protecting the natural wealth of the environment, and then you break it down into more digestible components. So biodiversity might be a component of that natural wealth, and then you can identify indicators towards biodiversity, for instance. So we draw from that and took on the challenge of trying to break down the open internet and the globally connected internet into more digestible components in order to build a toolkit in which you can sort of do internet impact assessments or preliminary impact assessments. And I generally think that that is a promising tool and promising sort of norm to foster globally, that when we make decisions about the internet, we foster a norm about thinking 2 steps ahead and thinking about the impact of our decisions, both for avoiding sort of unilateral decisions that might have these unintended consequences, but also as a form of accountability mechanism against those that sort of deliberately work against an open internet. I'm happy to speak more about that and engage in the conversation later on. So thank you very much.
Carl, thank you. I mean, I think it's really interesting. I think that's probably the 3rd time today, a parallel between questions around AI ethics and policy responses and environmental policy and environmental responses has been made. So it's really interesting that you've also kind of pursued that approach. I think it's also really interesting that phrase, make it a norm of thinking 2 steps ahead, I think is a really, really succinct way of expressing a lot of what we're talking about today. Ruth, can I turn to you, please?
Of course, and thank you so much, Anthony, and Tech UK for the invitation. I come at this from a slightly different, and I hate to say, given the audience, less techie approach. So Index on Censorship, of which I am the chief executive, was founded 50 years ago. We were founded to provide a physical platform, as was appropriate then, a published magazine, to publish the work of dissident writers, academics, and scholars who were behind the Iron Curtain because their words couldn't be heard there. It was very literally Graham Greene, because Graham Greene was involved in our founding. So it has a very Cold War spy era feel to our launch. And we used to sneak out, which shows the challenge of information 50 years ago and the challenge of information now. We used to have to physically sneak out people's work. We would publish it in the UK and we would sneak it back in. And it would be passed from house to house as a means of solidarity, so that they knew that the rest of the world was listening and knew about what was happening to them as they lived in repressive regimes. Now, it is our 50th birthday, but I just want to read to you the op-ed that was in the Times on the launch of our founding, because it is pertinent to this conversation. Stephen Spender was a senior poet, was a point-needed US poet laureate, but was actually British. And he wrote in the opening op-ed for Index: the world is moving in two directions, one towards the narrowing of distances through travel, increasing interchange between scientists who take a worldview of problems such as the exploration of space, ecology, or population. The other is towards the shutting down of frontiers, the ever more jealous surveillance by governments and police of individual freedom. The opposites are fear and openness, and in being concerned with the situation of those who are deprived of their freedoms, one is taking a side of openness. And that is sort of the founding principle, as it turns out, many years later, of what we're talking about today. And that's whether, and that's the internet. It comes with many, many different challenges for all of us. As Katie outlined, there are challenges and ongoing and consistent debates, which I think have caused me to go to the hairdressers to get my hair dyed repeatedly, which may also have been the same for others, around safety and security, digital regulation. But the reality is, what do we use the internet for, and how much has our world changed because of it? It is now impossible to talk about our online lives versus our offline lives. We have lives and we use the same for both. So it's how we can make sure that there is space for debate, there is space for challenge, there is a respect agenda, or rather a tolerance agenda online that allows constant debate, while at the same time allowing all of us to use what we use social media for. Now, I'm sure there will be a conversation about the international role of the internet and especially how we use it to engage with our dissidents. But just to touch on it for a second, I'm doing a huge amount of work with someone that is challenging the Chinese firewall. I speak to them via encrypted communication or via Twitter direct mail. I think I may have just told the Chinese government how to see my messages, but still, the internet allows me to speak to them in a way that is safest for them, and that they can continue to do their work when their work is extraordinarily challenging and they have to be very brave to do it. We are providing a platform for dissidents, for those people who share our liberal values. And I think that, for me at least, we've got to look at this, especially in a Western context, through the prism of the values of liberal democracy, which is what we're talking about, which makes it very, very hard for us, because these are international platforms and it's an international world. But for us, what do these values actually mean? And what does freedom actually mean? Well, it means something very unique when you consider it through the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and through the prism of shared information. And so, although very much not techie, and I'm very sorry, but for me, this is about the tool of the internet and how it facilitates conversation and debate and information, and making sure that wherever you are, you have the tools that allow you to be part of a global conversation.
Thank you, Ruth. I think that's the first time Stephen Spender's been quoted at a Tech UK event, which I think is a rather wonderful thing. But you, you talk about this looking at these issues through the prism of sort of liberal democracies, but there is some feeling, I suppose, that prism's getting narrower as in terms of some of the geopolitical changes that we're seeing around the world. Lots to come back to, but I want to move on to Azim to give you an opportunity to share your perspectives.
Hi, sure. So thanks for having me, and it's been nice to attend the summit today as well. Some great talks, really interesting. So I'm coming at this from an academic background, as someone who's kind of benefited from this open data and also open social media data. So I can talk a little bit about some of the benefits for the kind of wider academic community. So this idea of greater access to data, so openly sharing research data, it provides benefits to the entire scientific community if you've got access to data from kind of social platforms and other digital platforms. And from the academic perspective, we're interested in kind of having easy access to information and data to kind of analyze that and kind of see, for example, when it comes to COVID-19 or other kind of health topics, drivers of disinformation campaigns, spreaders of fake news. And there are certain platforms that are kind of really providing this data. So Twitter is a really good case study of someone who's really open, who's providing data to academics. They've launched the new academic track API as well. So we can come in and collect up to 10 million tweets per month on a variety of different topics. And we can kind of analyze this data, but not all of these technology companies are actually providing that level of data, which makes it hard to kind of verify any in-house research or experiments that they might be doing. So by kind of having access to that, a lot of different academic disciplines and fields could actually benefit from kind of having this open access and open data.
Thank you very much. Katie, I wanted to come back to the 5 principles that you set out, which I think were really interesting because as a company, clearly, as you said, you see the internet at its best and its worst, both in terms of I suppose at the sort of behavior of individuals, but also in terms of state actors and others. And we had, Carl Miller, gave us a really interesting talk earlier today when he was talking about the challenge of disinformation in particular, and where he was sort of saying that in many ways, as liberal democracies, we hadn't quite woken up yet to the extent to which some very large bad actors were putting extraordinary efforts into seeking to sort of manipulate some of the debate and discussion on this open internet. What is it about your principles, I suppose, that you think is really going to help us collectively counter in a way the big challenge that Carl sort of set out?
It's a great question. I think looking at something like state-backed information operations, we are always going to need to be on the front foot and innovating as quickly, more quickly than that minority of actors who are seeking to abuse the services provided by social media. So I think when it comes to the principles laid out, one of the most important here is that aspect of competition, innovation, and thinking about content moderation beyond just leave up or take down. For something like misinformation, one of the most important ways you can guard against its effects is by making available to people, amplifying, supporting, highlighting credible sources of information. Like during the COVID-19 pandemic, if someone were searching for information about COVID-19, they are directed to the NHS website. So they are quickly connected with an authoritative source of information. And that's beyond just leave up or take down, but is a fundamental way of addressing the challenges associated with misinformation. But I think that the innovation piece is really key as well. Something we're currently trialing at Twitter is more of a Wikipedia style approach to the challenges of misinformation. And it's something we're calling Birdwatch. If you want to have a look, just Google Twitter Birdwatch and you can see it. And there we're thinking about how we can draw upon Twitter users themselves as helping to provide context to tweets that go beyond specific areas of misinformation where we have policies like COVID-19 or synthetic manipulated media. And just, if I come across a tweet, maybe I could be directed to a BBC News article or some other piece of context that would help me better understand that piece of information. So I think that as we develop regulatory solutions, as we develop wider solutions across society, leaving space for companies to continue to innovate and find new solutions to addressing these problems is really critical.
Thank you. Can I come back to Carl then, in terms of how effective do you think these kind of new approaches can be in terms of major platforms providing kind of more innovative solutions that allow, in a way, a sort of more of a kind of crowdsourcing of support to kind of uphold open and democratic dialogue? Do you, from your perspective, do you feel that that's a workable way through?
I'm not sure if I'm able to say that it's the answer, but I like the approach, and I think to Katie's point, the ability of those platforms to have the freedom to innovate, to find those solutions is incredibly important, and to allow for that sort of, let's say, mid-range way of moderating content that isn't just about leaving up or taking down. I think that's really important. And I missed, unfortunately, the speech on the Wikipedia, but to me, Wikipedia has always been a good case in point for when crowdsourced information has been reasonably successful in terms of fostering that sort of community spirit, which I think is a critical part of this, that community spirit of seeking for a reliable source of information, which Wikipedia has been for many, many years. And of course, there is a problem when people are trying to manipulate it, but I think that it's helpful to take lessons, at least from that community approach that Wikipedia has had and that crowdsourcing approach, and to allow the platforms to innovate towards those ends.
Ruth, coming back to you, I wanted to sort of ask, in a way, as an organization that has been sort of, got such a long legacy and history in terms of working in these areas around kind of opening up free speech. In today's world, just how fundamental is the internet itself to our ability to conduct free speech? For some, are some people having to resort to other mechanisms to share their voices?
Well, I like to think that we help them share their voices, but if I tell you the Christmas e-card that Katie will get next week, the artwork on it was drawn by a graphic artist who is literally hiding in a cave in Afghanistan. And the one thing he has access to is the internet. And I get to give, and I get to amplify his voice and to share his art and his story because the internet exists. Now, 30 years ago, that would have been impossible. So I think we just need to be aware of quite how powerful what we're doing is. If you think about some of the atrocities that we know of that are happening as we're speaking, we know that there are camps in Xinjiang province, or not to make this too political, but Xinjiang province with the Uyghurs. We know what has happened as it's happening to Aung San Suu Kyi in Myanmar. We know what's happening as things are happening because of the internet. We knew about the Arab Spring. We knew, if you compare, for example, the Arab Spring to events in Tiananmen Square, which were 25 years before, it took national media to get to a point to be able to share their stories, their recordings. The images took weeks to come out. Actually, we knew these things as they were happening, and they were live on television in front of us. And that's because of you. So I don't think we should underestimate. It's really easy, especially because the conversation around the internet keeps coming back to digital regulation and harm, to forget that joy comes out of the internet, to forget that over the pandemic, I had the most surreal conversation with a retired woman in her mid-70s earlier this week, and she said, "Oh, so when I'm walking my dogs, that's when I catch up on my podcasts." Now, the fact that technology has become so normal that that's how we live our lives, we've got to remember the joy that comes out of it, and also not just the horror, but the relief of when there's been a terror attack and we use technology sources to make sure our friends and family are alive. That when we want to share engagements and births, and it's immediate and our friends get to hear, and also some of the horrible things that means that media is disseminated even in our own lives. So God forbid when someone loses a parent, putting it on social media so that you don't have to tell everybody, and you don't have to make, as for some of us who are slightly older, the 20 phone calls that you'd have had to have made to everybody to tell them something horrendous has happened. Actually, there are ways and means of doing it because our lives have changed beyond all recognition. And for most of us, I think this is a case in point. I don't know the percentages, and I'm sure the Internet Society or you will, but the overwhelming majority of the British people have been very fortunate to have the tool that we're using to get them through the last 18 months. I mean, one of my friends, her mum couldn't come to her at Christmas last year. They had Zoom on for the whole of Christmas Day so that she was present and involved and could hear the kids opening presents. Right? So she was involved in the chat without having to physically be there. That would have been impossible. So I think that we need to remember the positives and the wider engagement, and also the fact that, I talked earlier on about the solidarity of having my magazine that would pass from house to house. They can show Twitter feeds with their own words on. They can know that the world is paying attention to their stories. When we talk to journalists in Afghanistan who are still there, like, what do you need from us? We just need to know that people are still listening. We can demonstrate people are still listening immediately, and that is because of the tools that are provided. It isn't to say that there aren't bad sides to this, because I've faced them, but overwhelmingly, we get so much on the internet. We need to be really careful that we don't have unintended consequences of trying to over-regulate.
I think it's fascinating. I think that a point to reflect on would be, what would have happened if COVID had happened 20 years ago, and we'd all manage with text messaging and dial-up internet as our only recourse to it's impossible to think how the economy would have functioned. But I'm really pleased you sort of raised the question of kind of regulation, and I wanted to expand on that a little bit more in terms of clearly we are at a moment where there was a real push to regulate to address some of the the most obvious and pressing kind of harms that we see online. But I think Katie kind of raised an interesting point that we actually have an opportunity to regulate, not just to stop bad things happening, but actually to regulate to enable good things to happen. And in particular, she talked about the ability, to enable more sharing of information with researchers and so on. How do you think we're doing in terms of the sort of the democratic debate, that we're having as a liberal democracy about the role of technology in our society? Are you worried that in sometimes it loses perspective or gets out of balance? But also, but we surely have to recognize, that there are people who've faced some terrible things in terms of online, and those issues have to be addressed. I don't know who would like to come in. It's an open question.
No, I just so I'm a former member of Parliament. I got a huge amount of abuse online. In fact, I would urge no one to Google me, but you see really unpleasant things. But I still believe about an open internet in spite of that, because of the positives that outweigh it. I think where the sector, and I think, in the history of communications, the sector is still a baby. It's an emergent, even though it may not feel like it because we use it every day, it's still an emergent industry. It's an emergent communications platform. And so there were mistakes made. I think everyone would recognise that over the last 15 years, there have been significant mistakes, and no one was fast enough to realise the potential harm. But that doesn't mean that we should overcompensate. And my big concern as a former politician is that we're ending up in a place where, because the arguments can become so technical so quickly, it's so much easier for politicians who only see the internet through the prism of online shopping or social media platforms, that they just want to be able to point at something to say they fixed it without understanding the impact of what they're trying to fix. So I think we've got to be really, there is an onus on the sector to be much more forthright, about saying that tools have changed and what is available, and to say that things are constantly evolving, to make demands on politicians to legislate for tomorrow, not for yesterday, which I fear is what's happening, and to push back about the positives of what is already happening. And I feel, and I can say this because I'm outside the sector, I think, that the sector's getting really nervous and is becoming scared about pushing back, and allowing themselves to become the bogeyman, whereas actually your contribution is so much more than that. And I think it's how you, without telling politicians they're wrong, because that never works, but pushing back to say, can I just remind you of all the other things and how many jobs in your constituencies have been dependent on it, and what did happen during COVID? And by the way, people had to have online parties, Christmas parties, instead of physical ones. I think that might be an effective argument for you right now. But I think there's a lot that
literally this is an online.
Exactly, online party. I just think there are lots of different ways that you can push back, and that you need to, in order to secure the sector going forward.
I mean, from a Tech UK perspective, I think that's a really interesting point, because it's certainly one I think I think you're right. I think we do struggle with, because I think we recognise the problems are serious problems, and the harms are serious harms, but yet there is still so much good to talk about.
I mean, just in context I'll stop talking because I realise I've dominated, but my most recent person for harassing me online was in April this year. So I am very, very aware, I've had death threats, I've had every level of abuse that you can get on social media. There are problems there, but the joy of some of the new tools is I typically don't know when I'm at the centre of something grim until someone says something nice about me in rebuttal, because that breaks through and the horror doesn't. So I just think, we need to celebrate how far we've come and be much more forthright in where we're going.
Yeah, and it's very interesting. I mean, Tim Clement-Jones in an earlier session, who sort of led the establishment of the APPG on AI, I think voiced a similar frustration, I think, with some of his parliamentary colleagues, that, as you say, there was this very limited but quite specific experience they have online, and somehow, that desire to say, I've just fixed something, without really engaging with the debate. Wasim, I wanted to bring you in on that point, really, which is about kind of if you were trying to explain or talk to some of those politicians about getting the balance right, and in terms of ensuring we get the benefits of this openness, whilst also addressing some of the challenges, what would you say to them?
Yep. So from my perspective, it's been about kind of data access and ease of data, and some of my colleagues around the world as well, kind of social media researchers, they were lobbying for kind of more access and kind of putting pressure on the social media companies that aren't actually releasing some of the kind of social data, to try and get that more readily available, to kind of analyze that for insight. And the argument we were kind of making is the staggering amount of people kind of on these platforms on a daily basis. So over 4 billion active social media users estimated, and 13 new users signing up every single second, and kind of spending 2 to 3 hours a day on average kind of using those. And the academic research, by having this open data, has been really unique and interesting. So in sociology, computer science, political science, and even engineering, they've been tapping into Twitter data and other social media platforms, and getting real good insight from there. In our own work, using Twitter data during the COVID-19 pandemic, we looked at sentiments towards the lockdowns using Twitter data, and seeing the kind of positivity and measuring that against the negative sentiments over time. We also looked at sentiments towards masks as well. So Twitter data provides real-time instant access on a variety of topics. from a public health perspective, sociological perspective, we can tap into that and straight away see what the narrative is. And if people are kind of spreading fake news and disinformation, we can easily kind of spot that. And we can do that with Twitter because they've been so generous with their data. But some of those other platforms are really closed. And there could be quite a lot of stuff that's happening, a lot of kind of disinformation, misinformation being spread that's just invisible at the moment. We can't actually get access to that. So it'd be kind of around this idea of trying to kind of open up access and get independent access to it. So I know sometimes some social media companies might provide access, but you still have to work in-house. Whereas with Twitter, externally, we can just connect, get that data independently, analyze it and publish it without actually Twitter being involved in that research.
Katie, you know, what Wasim said there was really, really interesting. And, you know, coming back to, again, to what Carl was saying in the earlier session, you know, arming people like Wasim with the data so that they can be really powerful allies as we try to collectively, you know, work to keep this internet open, I think is incredibly important. And I mean, you said yourself, you know, transparency is foundational. But, you know, I mean, as you know, I work with all sorts of technology companies, and, you know, doing what you've done isn't easy, you know, for any large company or any large corporation. It kind of often goes against the instincts of the organization to make itself and make its data as transparent and to partner. How is it you, as a business, kind of overcame those instincts? And were able to do it. And what, you know, what advice could you offer to others in other companies maybe who are thinking, gosh, that's really interesting. How on earth am I going to persuade people within the business that that's the way we should go?
Well, Twitter is an overwhelmingly public platform, and that makes it very different to, say, a more private platform where it's just a different set of data or it's a different type of discussion. And I guess that's meant we just have a long history of working with researchers. Over the past decade, tens of thousands of researchers have used our Twitter APIs to conduct a wide range of research. What I do think is that as policymakers develop laws, develop regulations, this is something that they can be thinking about. What sorts of mechanisms or risk assessments or thought processes need to be in place to help companies think about how they can work more effectively with the research community, with the academic community, how they can make that data available. I mean, on Twitter, both the amazing aspects of the online conversations we see and the challenges are incredibly well documented. And you know, in my open remarks, I talked about the benefits in terms of working with a wider range of experts on these issues. But I think there's also benefits in accountability as well. It means that if we say we are doing X, Y, Z to address a specific online harm, then you don't just need to take Twitter's word for it, but experts, researchers, academics can look at the public conversation taking place on Twitter and make assessments around challenges like misinformation or hate speech and assess how effectively our measures are addressing those issues.
We've got about, I think we've got about 10 minutes left of the discussion. And I wanted to really kind of get the thoughts of all of you on really, I mean, because it strikes me that these are some really, really huge issues that we're talking about, yet there's probably still a relatively narrow group of people, even within the technology sector or in the political or policy world, who really kind of get the big picture here. And I wanted to ask the extent to which each of you think that you know, things are getting better, whether actually you feel that we have a good sense of how to address these challenges and whether we're finding our way through, or whether actually things are getting worse. And to that point, you know, Ruth, you know, we talked about that lens of liberal democracies and the values of the open internet is getting narrower. Bit of a long question, but how well are these issues understood? What more can we do to bring people on board? And are things getting better or getting worse? Carl, over to you.
Thank you. So I think unfortunately it's getting worse. I mean, I made a pitch for impact assessments in my opening remarks, and I do think that that is a critical component of improving things because it helps illuminate some of the consequences of actions. But sometimes it might be a communications issue of the implications of some of the policies that are coming into place, and in a way that is almost technology being the victim of its own success. So if you take, for instance, the upcoming UK online safety bill, we see direct threats to the use of end-to-end encryption in that bill. And somehow there seems to be an idea that you could magically allow to have backdoors in an encrypted system, an end-to-end encrypted system, and still have an end-to-end encrypted system. But that's just something that it just doesn't work because an end-to-end encrypted system is very basic, that it's just two parties of the communication that have the key. There's no third party involved. So even such a fundamental thing that a third party breaks the very fundamental property of that security system is hard to communicate because there's a belief that technology somehow will resolve this. And of course, the consequences of not sort of looking at the technology, how it works and what the constraints in the technology is, opens up for a whole range of new challenges. So in this case, by weakening the use of end-to-end encryption, you're opening up your threat vector for a number of new cybersecurity attacks, which in turn creates new insecurities. So sometimes it's hard to even get across the most simplest of points because there's a belief that somehow technology will come and save us. And I think that's actually a part of the problem that is making the state worse. We have this overconfidence that technology will solve everything, but sometimes it's other issues that needs to be in place. Technology is a component of it, but it needs to be complemented by other actions.
Thank you. I realize I've slightly misread the time. I think we've only probably got a couple more minutes, but so Ruth and Wasim, if I can go to you very briefly in terms of, I suppose, final thoughts.
So just final thoughts, and in terms of what you said, I think the biggest fear that I have about what happens next is the phrase that's being used in the UK and exported everywhere else with regards to regulation, which is legal but harmful. Because as you know, you rightly challenged me on when I talk about liberal values, even a British or a European context of what legal but harmful is very different to how Modi would apply it, or how Bolsonaro would apply it, or even how Trump would have applied it. And I think we've got to be really, really careful about the language that is adopted here, the language that is being used for the DSA in the European Parliament, because the long-term consequences for global internet freedom are really at risk unless we get it right here.
Thank you. And Wasim?
Yeah, sure. So just to kind of summarize, I was talking about how greater access to data and openly sharing data can really provide a lot of benefits to the entire scientific community. And that data can often have advantages. So it could be free from interview or survey biases and can be captured in real time and kind of complement our other research. So it's really beneficial for academics to be able to kind of tap into this data source across a number of platforms and kind of analyze it for insight and verify kind of spreaders of misinformation and disinformation.
Thank you so much. And Katie, any last final thoughts from you?
I would just underscore what Ruth said, that I think what's most important and what stands out from this discussion is for governments to not lose sight of the global precedents they're setting, especially when it comes to regulation. And I think it's something we should all be proud of, that the UK is looking to lead the way on online safety. But if they do want to lead the debate globally, they must also set the highest standards of transparency and due process in their own legislation. Thank you very much.
Look, I may be a bit biased because I chaired the session, but I think that was an absolutely fascinating discussion. So thank you to all of you for taking part today and sharing your thoughts. Really, really rich insights. And I, for one, will be going back and looking at the video again and thinking further on what you've all said. So thank you so much for joining us today.